All right, good morning. We have what seems to be an absolutely beautiful morning here in West Lafayette. And so let's ruin that by talking about macroeconomics. Who are we kidding, though? What better scene to discuss macroeconomics than a beautiful Friday morning? What I wanted to do was similar to some of the videos from yesterday, was just to maybe make some relatively short dynamics videos where the thing about this particular section of intermediate macro is that we end up front loading a lot of the tools that will sort of persist for the kind of remainder of the models, at least as we're sort of contemplating, this sort of economic fluctuation part of the course. And then when we get to the very last part of the course, we get more into economic growth, which it will be very much informed by some of the stuff that we're doing now, but definitely is a different level of analysis, a different set of questions ultimately, and so therefore different models. But in this, what I thought I would do is sort of talk a little bit about some of the kind of flexibility of both the ISLM framework as well as aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Going back to what I was saying before, the thing that always really grabbed me about this, and in many ways, as I've mentioned, um, caused me to fall in love with economics, and in particular macroeconomics, was that I felt like not only were there a relatively straightforward set of tools, mathematical, graphical, also empirical, which we're going to talk more about sort of empirical stuff next week when we sort of start to critique the Keynesian approach and talk about some of the sort of so-called post-Keynesian ideas, as well as monetarism. Um, but the thing that I really loved about macro models is that as they were being developed, there was a real sense that these models were, in a sense, additive of the good ideas that came before them. And so when we kind of talk about this classical, neoclassical sort of the initial, paradigm in economics that really dominated economic thought up until Keynes, sort of comes on the scene. And it's not just Keynes, by the way. Keynes gets a lot of the credit duly, but there are some other economists in this time period, Phillips, who we're going to talk about in some stuff today as well. But also, of course, Fisher, who is predates Keynes in many ways. I think that he gets ultimately he gets sort of set inside of the kind of classical neoclassical world, and as a result, Fisher kind of becomes someone that we don't really maybe give as much credit as we should in the context of Keynesian, because the thing that Keynes did is he brought forth from the classical neoclassical world the ideas that he thought were actually quite good. And so the sort of interesting thing about the Keynesian framework is that it's really just kind of focused on this sort of short to median run time period. We're already in the context of economic fluctuation. We're already kind of talking short run, and so even when we talk about the long run in the classical or in the Keynesian sense, it's what does that constitute ultimately, as opposed to when we get to like economic growth, we're going to think about economic models as existing over decades. The long run here isn't really like that even long. The long run here would be maybe 2 or 3 years, even less maybe. And when we say short run, long run in the context of this particular aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we are thinking about it from the perspective of some sort of shock, exogenous shock. One of the big shocks that we experienced in the United States in the 1970s is we have this negative supply shock. What's interesting about that concept of a negative supply shock was that it didn't really exist as an idea up until the point in which it happened. And it sort of just so happened to be the case that the Keynesian sort of neoclassical synthesis did a really good job of being able to incorporate a negative supply shock in ways that the classical model really just, when you say supply creates demand, the negative supply shock isn't a negative supply shock. It's just, it's a correction. But when you look at the early 1970s in the United States, we have this significant set of negative supply shock, beginning with the oil price surge in the early 1970s, 1973, 74, which, is ultimately given credit for the 74, 75 recession, which was a pretty deep and significant recession for the United States. We don't, because 7 years later, you have the Volcker recession, which was an even deeper recession than that. You also had a smaller recession at the very end of the 1970s that somehow I think gets more discussion than that 74, 75 recession, maybe because it just happened right before the Volcker recession. So I think they kind of get lumped in. But sort of regardless, this conversation over, how do we take the existing models or the past models and how do we incorporate their ideas in ways that strengthens the models that we use today? That's a really heavy focus here. And so what I just want to do here real quick, I've talked enough. There's been enough exposition at this point doing the setup. You notice that I take forever to set things up. It's just the nature of me, unfortunately. I'm trying to get better. But so I have two sort of conceptions here of just sort of focused on aggregate supply. We certainly can put aggregate demand anywhere here that we want to. For example, we could, assume that aggregate demand exists, in sort of this equilibrium. And so, the idea would be that this economy is currently at full employment. Everything's fine, right? That's the way you could sort of think about this particular economy. And a way to sort of think about that, to strengthen it, is this idea that aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply are in the same equilibrium as aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. So, in a sense, the argument here is that where we are currently in the short run, there's going to be no equilibrium that moves us off of this. So output shouldn't increase, output shouldn't decrease. There should be no, in a sense, inflationary pressure, so on and so forth, right? Now, that's obviously just sort of one way that we can conceive of aggregate demand. The other way that we tend to think about it, and this is, of course, makes it make a lot of sense in the sort of Keynesian sense, is that we can sort of think about aggregate demand instead of as being down here. And what that implies is that we are currently in equilibrium in the short run below potential output. So we can call this Y0. And so, the idea is that if we think in terms of the short run, then we're going to think in terms of there being a short run equilibrium and then at the very least a long run equilibrium. I tend to like to add the medium run into that because I don't think it adds that much complexity to it. And to me, it just, ultimately, if we only believe there's a short run and a short run and a long run, then it's just that the medium run is zero, right? We can easily remove it from the model, but I think it's nice to have it there. The other thing too is that having the medium run section, and we'll talk about what that means in a second, actually empirically does better than not having it there, because ultimately what the medium run is ultimately going to represent is something that we see in the data. And is not something predicted by either the short run conception or the long run conception, but would be something predicted by this conception of the medium run. So this is the way that I think about it. I think a lot of economists probably think about it this particular way, but this helps me to make sense of things in my head, and also enables me, I think, to have a nuanced position on policy. Again, we want to make sure that in the development of your macroeconomic skills, that we're fighting against being pigeonholed into one particular framework. There's no reason for economists really anymore to be Keynesians or for economists to be post-Keynesians or monetarists or whatever. The truth is that when you look at like contemporary macro theory and contemporary macro empiricism, what we sort of come to a conclusion is that there's this sort of amalgamation of ideas that really seems to work well and seems to be flexible to a lot of different economic conditions. So why would we silo ourselves into sort of particular ideas? And I've never been one that's felt the need to be a particular type of economist, right? If you sort of held a gun to my head and said, what kind of macroeconomist would be? I guess I would sort of call myself a neo-Keynesian, but also I would be a neo-Keynesian with very strong neoclassical underpinnings. I think that ultimately uh, my position ends up being very close to the position of someone like James Tobin. So James Tobin was someone that we've definitely considered to be sort of a neo-Keynesian or even just a Keynesian. But I think Tobin was very open to a lot of other ideas as well. And so he ends up having this very fair assessment of macro, and he's not closed off necessarily. So when we get to sort of the Lucas critique and Phillips curve arguments, which we're going to get to in the next couple of lectures, um, he incorporates that more than he sort of rejects it, which ultimately I think generates a lot of respect from people and is, ultimately the reason why he is a Nobel Prize winner in economics. So anyway, there you go, more exposition. So going back to this, let's just focus ourselves, right here in this graph. And let's say that we put aggregate demand here. In a sense, we can say that the economy is in recession, or we could just say that the economy is below full employment, right? That's the way we want it. That's sort of the language here. We're below full employment. We can also say that we're below potential output or full output. But Keynes really liked to frame things in terms of employment ultimately, because it in a sense, I think, heightens for him the stakes. This isn't just about output. This is about job. This is about, having people in work. So that I think that makes a lot of sense. So now the idea is that, again, the sort of classical approach is you just let the economy equilibrate, and you're going to move down, to here, right? We've gone over this a lot. You get deflation in that scenario. You actually get a reduction in price level, but you do get back to full employment. So the idea here would be that deflation, in a sense, is a good thing because it gets you back to full employment. It wasn't really just Keynes that struck against that particular idea. There had been people that already had sort of, I think, questioned that sort of notion. I think the thing ultimately that we end up really being concerned about with respect to deflation is that there's this sort of concern with respect to wages, that if you have this sort of deflationary period, it's going to mechanically have to show up in the form of real wages. And then so the question then becomes, okay, well, if you have deflation, is it not possible that real wages will rise? The problem is that with deflation, what you also have is a loss of profitability with respect to firms. And in that loss of profitability, what you have is a reduction in the marginal product of labor. And we know mechanically that when you have a reduction in the marginal product of labor, then wages are going to fall. Real wages have to fall. So the sort of kind of Keynesian idea of deflation is that if you allow deflation to sort of take hold, you actually are going to ultimately reduce people's real wages. And if you reduce people's real wages, it's highly unlikely that gets you back to full employment, because what you have now done is drug down the consumption aggregate demand side of the economy. Remember, Keynes thinks everything through the economy is transmitted through aggregate demand. And so his argument is, actually, when the economy is below full employment, that is the precise time that you want to try to boost aggregate demand through expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. Now, on that particular point, kind of what did Keynes favor, fiscal or monetary policy? Keynes was very much influenced by, a sort of Fisherian view of inflation, which was very much, of course, developed with classical, the quantity equation, which shows up in the money market in many ways in Keynes' idea, was a classical economic idea. And so I think the idea that sort of Keynes definitely carries with it in sort of this particular perspective is that we have to be careful about inflation. We should definitely be worried about inflation. And even more than that, inflation can be seen as somewhat of a barometer as to how good or a bad job we are doing at stabilizing, promoting this idea of stabilized economic growth, right? So the economy has sort of fallen back to Y0. We don't want that. We want to get the economy back to full employment. So we're going to stabilize the economy, and we're going to try to push out aggregate demand. And we can just think about sort of there being a general policy goal that we want to get aggregate demand back out exactly to full employment. The nice thing about that is that you don't have necessarily inflation, because you're just getting the economy back to full employment. And so you sort of move in this particular direction. And so in a way, what you do is you get away with an increase in output, and you don't have to experience any inflationary pressure. So now what we can do is we can come over here to this aggregate supply curve, and we can think about there being sort of three different sections potentially of an aggregate supply curve. And so where we are in terms of the current economic system is going to define for us whether or not we can boost the economy through aggregate demand, get an improvement in output, and if we get that improvement in output, what inflation are we going to have to experience? And so in this sort of A area right here, you can see here that we can shift out aggregate demand. Just sort of draw two kind of mini aggregate demand curves here. So shift aggregate demand in this direction. You see that doing so gets us a higher output and no inflation. So to Keynes, this is like a no-brainer. You should absolutely try to stabilize the economy if you think you're in the flat portion of the aggregate supply curve. Why would you be in the flat portion of the aggregate supply curve? One, you're thinking in the very short run. And the second reason why you would be in the flat part of the aggregate supply curve is because you are in recession. Now, why would the flat part of the aggregate supply curve imply ultimately that you're in recession? Because if you're currently in equilibrium in the flat part of the aggregate supply curve, and for example, because you have recently experienced an uptick in unemployment, that you have, in a sense, moved backward for some particular reason. Maybe you don't necessarily perceive it to be a recession, but in a sense, there's like an empirical sort of truth to the fact that you were in a part of the aggregate supply curve due to reduced economic behavior. That means that there's, in a sense, downward pressure being put on inflation. And that downward pressure creates the sort of flatness of the aggregate supply curve. So the reason why there would be flatness in the aggregate supply curve is not just because we're in the short run, but also because essentially there's not any natural inflationary pressure in the economic system. If there's no natural inflationary expectation in the economy, that is because people do not, as I just mentioned, expect there to be inflation. So expected inflation would be zero, or at least be low. We could say it's we don't have to say zero. We can just say that it's low. Well, then we have to sort of ask ourselves, why do people expect inflation to be low? People would expect inflation to be low because economic growth is not going to translate into inflation. Well, because there is this general sense that economic growth tends to put upward pressure on inflation. And why is that? Because economic growth in the Keynesian model is transmitted through aggregate demand. And, ceteris paribus, if we're looking at any type of aggregate supply curve other than short run, so medium run or long run, either an upward sloping or a completely vertical curve, we get inflationary pressure from economic growth. This actually gets us to the idea that we don't necessarily want the economy to go beyond Y bar. We don't want to try to just grow the economy as fast as possible. Again, going back, I mentioned this yesterday, We can think about the 1960s as an example of quote unquote overheating the economy. We can also maybe look at the early 2000s as another example of overheating the economy. Although the interesting thing about the 2000s example is that we also, sort of really seem to not have much inflationary pressure. And that was despite the fact that the Fed, policy back then was pretty loose. So there's a little bit of a puzzle there. We'll talk about that certainly next week. Then, if we move into a part of this B region, if we move into this part of the aggregate supply curve, now the perception instead must be that expected inflation is now sort of greater than zero. Not necessarily like we expect a ton of inflation, but we expect there to be some inflation. Again, if there's an expectation of some inflation, that means there's an expectation of some economic growth, and so therefore it's very likely that we're in this portion of the aggregate supply curve. Here, you can get higher output from boosting aggregate demand, but you're going to pay for it with inflation. That's a Keynesian idea, by the way. Again, sort of people often, lay at the feet of Keynes this idea, oh, the government should just try to boost aggregate demand. Da, 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 da. No, that's not really true at all. Keynes said, it's a big question whether you would in fact want to try to boost aggregate demand if you were in the B section of the aggregate supply curve because of the cost of inflation. Now, I think Keynes personally ultimately felt that there would be certainly times when you would rather have the economic growth than the inflation, but it still would be better to have the economic growth instead of the inflation, or I'm sorry, alongside the inflation. I think the COVID experience was certainly one of those. In order to get the economy back to where it was, to get us back to quote unquote full employment, we had to, I think, very rapidly grow the economy back because we'd sort of shut everything down. And so, regardless of whether you think we should have done that, we did it. And so, when we went to go grow, rapidly grow the economy, what we did is we sort of jumped very quickly. We were in this A region because the economy was depressed. Quite literally depressed. Go back and look at inflation in April, May, June of 2020. No inflation, bordering on deflation at that point. So we're clearly in a flat part of the aggregate supply curve. Aggregate demand is also going back. So again, we know we're in the flat part because aggregate demand has fallen, but we haven't seen deflation, right? So there's that little bit of an idea to know we're not seeing deflation yet, but we're certainly not seeing any kind of inflationary pressure. Then, as we move into 2021, 2022, we keep boosting aggregate demand multiple times, right? We have the first stimulus under Trump. We have expansionary monetary policy in 2020 and 2021. We have the stimulus under Biden, right? Just inflationary. It was no surprise to economists whatsoever that we had inflation. I think what was surprising to a lot of economists, myself included, was the appetite for inflation. I thought that people might sort of understand to some extent that we were trying to keep aggregate demand. I'm sorry, we were trying to keep output up, and the cost of that was going to be inflation. But people don't really know that, right? And I can't fault them for not knowing that. But I do think that's kind of what happened. And then I do think there's some argument to be had also that we maybe, if you put in the full totality of all of the policy from not just 2020 on, but go back to fiscal and even monetary policy back to 2010, right? 2010, zero interest rate policy of the Fed, quantitative easing, massive increases in the money supply as means to boost liquidity, to keep the loanable funds market afloat, to keep the economy afloat, basically, right? We had about an $850 billion fiscal stimulus in 2010. Most economists look at that and they think that was way too small. The stimulus should have been much bigger. Doesn't matter. That's still inflationary eventually. It's not inflationary in the short run because we're in the flat part of the aggregate supply curve. It, though, becomes inflationary. So there is some conversation now about permanent policy versus temporary policy. That'll be part of the conversation we have next week as well. We have the Affordable Care Act, massive increase in spending there. We get into the Trump administration. You have a tax cut, basically, increased government spending, inflationary. we get COVID. Now, the thing about COVID is that on one hand, it's not deflationary. It reduces inflationary pressure because of the reduction in aggregate demand. But simultaneously, there was an increase in inflationary pressure caused by the supply side shock, right? Supply side shock. So supply shifts back to the left and aggregate demand shifts back to the left. The net result is prices are about the same, but at a much lower level of output. That also means that when we go to boost aggregate demand, because essentially, so the idea here is this. Let me get rid of all this. Some of this is getting really. I'm bad about letting everything get real messy on me here. So the idea here would be like this is sort of where we were. So let's say aggregate supply in 2019. And the idea is that we have kind of this. We have this is aggregate supply in 2020. So post-COVID, shall we say. And so let's say like prior to 2019, oh, this should be, sorry. Oh. So we're probably here, which means that in 2019, we had sort of relatively low inflationary pressure. We had sort of good output in 2019. Then 2020 happens, and we have this sort of immediate supply shock. So there's kind of the first movement. Then aggregate demand shifts back. So that kind of makes the full movement even further, something out to sort of 2020 there. And then, of course, what we end up having is the supply curve stays there. There continues to be aggregate supply crimps all over the world. And so aggregate supply stays at 2020, and then we just start boosting aggregate demand. And so what that means is that I would say by the time we got to the CHIPS Act, let's just put it there, right? CHIPS Act, I think had a lot of good stuff in it, by the way, but was certainly an increase in government spending. And so what you get is to a point where everything becomes inflationary, right? Every single thing becomes inflationary. Even if there's an argument that it's good government spending, it's government spending coming at a point where we're no longer getting any boost to output, but we're getting inflationary pressure. And if you go back and you look at the economy as we get into 2024, the end of 2024, we see a real slowdown in economic growth. Economic growth starts to slow down. It's still positive, it's still good, but it's just starting to kind of slow down. And I think that speaks to the fact that we were just not getting as much movement and output, in part because there's diminishing returns to policy kind of naturally, but also we were just kind of reaching the end of that current aggregate supply curve. And then so the sort of hope is that maybe the aggregate supply curve is going to shift back out to where it was. I think the idea is that it's kind of about to that point now. Although I think that there are still a lot of people who think that the aggregate supply is something closer to here, in part because of the more sort of recent uncertainty and kind of tariff policy posturing of the Federal Reserve, that we've almost in a sense, I'm sorry, not Federal Reserve, the Trump administration, we've almost shifted aggregate supply back, maybe, is sort of a potential argument. And so that's why if you look at all the sort of 2025 growth estimates, it's not necessarily looking great. We might be okay, but we're really starting to be concerned about a couple different things. We're worried about kind of this sort of stagflation potential, I think, which is that we're going to have potentially higher inflation, again, because we've sort of voluntarily shifted the aggregate supply curve back. And then if people's uncertainty sort of starts to creep in, then the idea would be that, aggregate demand is going to shift way back. And then that means that you get inflation would supposedly sort of be tempered in this particular sense, right? Because aggregate demand is shifting back. But the concern would essentially be that because aggregate supply is shifting, you stay in that inflationary part of the aggregate supply curve. And so this is why a lot of sort of focus has been put on sort of looking at the productivity of the economy. Is that slowing down? Because we're really kind of starting to go back to really being a chief focus on aggregate supply, which I think makes a lot of sense.